Hello, everyone. My name is Kerry Ramirez, and I am the Managing Director of StudyMove. Thank you so much for joining this third key data update. And well, as you all know, it has been another few months of very, very eventful situation here in Australia, New Zealand, and pretty much all around the world. And when it seems that we are getting a handle of this virus, things change again. And this is creating, once again, a lot of uncertainties and a level of disruption that we haven't really experienced. And for that reason, today we thought it will be very useful just to share with you some data, and I'm just putting my slides on the screen, share with you some data that I'm hoping that is really going to help us just to imagine or visualizing the way to move forward. I think there are a lot of difficulties in trying just to have a strategic planning. I think that in the last 18 months, the sector has created so many different scenarios that for many reasons, they just keep changing. That is really, really hard at the moment just to see what could actually expect in the next following months. And that's really the aim of this session. We are trying really just to provide you with some key data that I think is going to help us just to understand how we actually going to move forward in the next following months. What are the economics or the drivers in terms of border restrictions that we have seen not only in Australia and New Zealand, but all across the world? And of course, what's going to be the role of the vaccination rollouts for the international education sector? So today we're going to have a session that in about 35 minutes will cover some key data parts of how we can actually move forward. And we'll start just to looking into some of the market trends that we have seen, especially here in Australia, using the latest data in terms of international student numbers. From there, we're going to talk about border restrictions. I think that it has been a lot of conversations and headlines about how we're missing out in terms of easing border restrictions. So it's important to understand what has been the drivers of the factors that are pushing other countries to ease borders restrictions. So we're going to talk about that, and I'm going to share some interesting data in that regard with each one of you. And of course, from there, we need to talk about the game changer, which is the vaccination rollouts, which we're not going to focus on how quick it's going or how slow it's going, but how can we expect that the vaccination as it progresses will have an impact of the international education sector. And all this really just to try to complement your own institutional analysis, just to give you probably some insights that will help us just to really start visualizing how we're actually going to progress for the rest of 2021. So I hope you really enjoy this session that we put together for each one of you today. As you know, about 18 months ago, we at StudyMove, we changed the mission of the company. And our objective since then, it has been just to support the international education to navigate this very, very difficult and challenging period. Sometimes it's not only probably the mission of the company, sometimes it feels it's the obsession of the company, but we're very thankful also for all the support that we receive. And it's great just to get feedback from a lot of institutions and education providers and organizations who are actually using the data and the analysis that we're putting together just to really help you just to navigate through this very uncertain period. Just a reminder before we start the presentation that all our 2021 data reports are available now. If you are interested in learning more about it, we will provide you with more information if you want. I think that Dimitri is going to probably share with you some of the links about those reports. But at this stage, what we have seen in terms of data that is required for, especially from universities, it's in regards to the fees. I think this is the time of the year when universities start to working on settling their fees for 2022. So we have a lot of data that could be very useful for each one of you. And recently we put together this is one of my favorite reports. It's a monster of a report that basically looks into all the articulation and pathways that exist across Australian universities. This has been a very, very useful report, and thank you to everybody for their feedback. it has been very useful for everybody that is looking to diversify their recruitment channels and try to have a better understanding of what can be done in this particular space. All right. So let's just start looking, first of all, just to have a better understanding of where we at, looking at the international student numbers here in Australia. Now, I know that in this presentation, there is a lot of friends from different sectors. We also have friends coming from New Zealand, but I think that a lot of the data that we're gonna present that will have a clear focus on higher education is still going to be very useful for you because there are a lot of very interesting lessons that all sectors and actually across both countries you can actually take on board. So what I'm going to show you is the recent, very recent, actually they came, I think 2 days ago, the recent number of international student enrollments across all sectors here in Australia. This is the year-to-date April numbers across all sectors. And unfortunately, as expected, we haven't seen any change on the trends. Basically, we keep looking that the ELICAS and the school sector has been experiencing a more steady decrease in international student enrollments. Unfortunately, we know that those sectors are the sector who are heavily affected by border restrictions because international students, they really like to have that face-to-face experience. And although it has been some great initiatives in the online space, we know that the majority of international applicants are looking still for that face-to-face in-country experience. So these sectors have been severely affected by border restrictions, and that trend hasn't changed since we started dealing with the pandemic about 18 months ago. In contrast, we have the vocational sector that is still having a steady growth, basically maintaining those very high numbers. The vet sector reached the record number of international student enrollments last year. And we know that a lot of those students now in the vet sector, they basically transferred from higher education last year, that when we were in the middle of the health emergency, they decided just to move into the vet sector for many reasons. And we, at the end of last year, we were wondering if those students from higher education that transferred to vet, they will go back to higher education this year. But it seems that they're staying in vet. Now, higher education is actually going down slightly. It's about 12% in comparison with last year. And it's very interesting just to look at the higher education data in more detail. What you can see now on the screen is basically the number of student enrollments year to date for April. So basically everything that is related to the first big intake of the year. And as you can see, and as I said before, we're about 12.6% lower than 2020. Now, basically at the moment, we're in the same number of student enrollments that we had in 2018. And I think that what it has been cushioning the effect of in student enrollments, of course, is the fact that we had a large number of students coming from previous years, which is all the continuing students progressing. And that actually has been helping to keep the student enrollment numbers in not such a bad situation. Also, we know that it has been great efforts done by the university sector in terms of online learning and transnational, and that's keeping the numbers in not such a bad situation. But we all know that the impact of COVID, especially in higher education, is not only in the student enrollments. When we actually take the cohort of continuing students and we look at only commencement students, that's when we actually see the effects of COVID-19. And that's what you can see now on the screen. You can see this continuous drop of commencement students, which is now about 22% less than 2020 and about 35% less than when we started the pandemic in 2019, sorry, before the pandemic in 2019. And that's, of course, the big concern that we have in the sector. We are very concerned that if border restrictions remain as they are now, this number is going to keep dropping and dropping and dropping. And of course, under these challenging situations, and when you look at the data for every single country, basically every single country is going in the same kind of direction, going south. Things don't look good when you actually look at each one of the different countries. And when you see all these very different difficult scenarios, it's very easy just to say, oh, well, everything is going down. Why should we bother? But I believe that this is exactly the time when we need to look at the data. This is a time when things are difficult. So we need to be more careful and trying to understand what are the main trends and what the data is telling us on the response from the market to the situation that we currently are facing. And that's what we're trying to share with you. We have been looking at this data from many, many angles. Like we look into different ways in looking at the data. And there are two big trends that I think they're interesting just to follow. The first one is when we look at international student commencements for the top countries for Australia for higher education. The top countries, you will see it on the screen, is China, India, Nepal, Hong Kong, and well, all of them. And they basically represent about 75% of the total student commencements. So what we have done is really just to understand how these top markets have been swinging before the pandemic and during the pandemic, just to have a better understanding of where are those mega trends in terms of student commencements. So what I'm going to show you is how the student commencements in each one of these top markets have been growing or decreasing in the last 3 years. As you can see on the chart, in 2019, most of these top markets actually grew in commencements. This was before the pandemic, of course, but they haven't grown more than 1,000 students in one particular year. Then in 2020, of course, these markets actually decreased, but once again, no more than 1,000 students. And of course, the effects of COVID-19 have been harder in 2021. And once again, it has been a decrease, but once again, no more than 1,000, with a few exceptions that I think is interesting just to learn and to follow from it. The first one, of course, is the story of China. China from 2018 to 2019 really didn't have a lot of growth. There are about 600 students that grow more from 2018 to 2019. If you remember, it's hard sometimes to think about what we were thinking in 2019. But in 2019, we're thinking about China as a soft market, that it will actually be very, very important for Australia, and it's the same for New Zealand, but it was getting a little bit soft, the growth of the Chinese market. Now, of course, in 2020, there has been the market that it has been probably, well, it was deeply affected. It was the first country that had to deal with COVID-19, and the effects are clearly there when actually you see that we experienced a decrease in commencements of more than 10,000 students. It was massive. It was actually the largest decrease in any market that we ever experienced in higher education here in Australia. But then in 2021, we had a bounce, and now we're actually 4,000 students up. This is mainly because it's undergraduate students from China who are actually accepting the value proposition and really being attracted to the value proposition of start online your degree now, and then when things get better, you can actually come back. These had actually been reinforced with additional support in terms of pricing with the scholarships, but it's something that is working for the Chinese market, definitely. Now, a very different story is what happened with the second largest market for Australia, which is India. India was actually experiencing a very important growth in 2019 with more than 6,000 commencements in comparison to the previous year. And then with COVID-19 hit, it went down 4,000, and then even more so, now there are 8,000 commencements less than the previous years. Now, the effects of COVID-19 in this case are also clearly affected by the preferences on a study level from this particular market. We know that the majority of students from India are looking for postgraduate education programs. And unfortunately, this premise of saying start online and come back when things are getting better, it doesn't work that well for postgraduate simply because of the duration of the program. Like if you're gonna do a 1-year master or 1.5 or even a 2-year master, and you're gonna do your first half of your degree online, and then maybe all your degree online, still doesn't work like that. And on top of that, we also need to know that or understand that students from this particular country are looking for programs in areas where it's very, very hard to deliver a good online program or online degree. I'm talking about the limitations that exist in things like engineering or sometimes areas like health, or sometimes areas like even information technology. So obviously there are like the ability to deliver the program is really affecting the engagement that we have with this particular market. And that also has been the experience on the third larger market, which is Nepal. Nepal, it has been recent that we have seen a drop in student commencements, but we know that this also is coming especially for students in the area of health, where online delivery is really, really hard for this particular study. So there is it's very interesting just really to see to this trend. And I really invite institutions to trying to really look into your own institutional data and trying to find this, because the data is really telling us some of the clear story of what's happening in the engagement that we currently have. And I think this also is really going to help us just to understand how we can actually move forward in the next following months to cushion the effects of the border restrictions. Now, we also look, of course, following this story, not only to every single market, but also to study levels. And it's exactly the same story. When we look at student commencements, and this is year-to-date March figures, so basically all semester one, as you can see here in Australian higher education, we have about 33,000 student commencements for undergraduate programs. And then it was a dip that is very small of 30,000 in 2021. Now, the story with postgrad is completely different. From 40,000 commencement in postgraduate studies, it went down to 28%. Very significant difference when we actually look at this by study level. And I think the data is giving us a very interesting lesson of something that it makes sense. What I think is a good reminder of how we can actually approach our marketing strategies in the following months. I think it's important to understand that we need to differentiate and see that undergraduate strategies, which have always been different to postgraduate strategies, will actually have a different set of conversion than the one that we get from a postgraduate levels. And I think this is important so institutions actually use this data and this lesson just really to adjust things like their scholarship strategy, pricing strategy, even your agent commission strategy when you actually differentiate by study level based on the situation that is created by border restrictions. I think also this shows that one of the issues that we have is clearly related to program delivery limitations. It's not only about how the perception that exists for our countries among international applicants. It's really a lot about the limitation that exists of not being able to provide online programs in certain areas that require the face-to-face contact, like engineering or health. So we need to be aware of that and understand that when we are planning for the next few months. And also, I think that it's important that we actually drill into the data so we can actually tune our strategies and actually get ready for the future planning that we're going to put together for the following months. And of course, everything is related to how we expect that borders restrictions actually may change or not. And this is exactly something that we're going to look at the moment. There has been a lot of conversations about travel restrictions. I think that we are actually feeling a little bit concerned that other countries are announcing that they are easing the restriction to international travel. So I think it's important just to take some time to really look to what's happening outside of the world. And not only thinking about when borders will open, which has been the question that it has been in our mind for too long, but also to think about how borders will actually reopen and how we can actually be ready, or what are the changes that we need to do inside of the international education to be ready when there are actually changes in the restrictions for international travel. So let's start with looking at travel restrictions around the world. We have seen a few headlines about this country is doing this or this country is doing that, but I think it's important just to have a clearer picture of what's happening all around the world. And there is a website called kayak.com, which is a very renowned website, which is all about travel, that has been actually looking at these changes in travel restrictions. And what we currently have is that across the planet, 82 countries are still categorizing what is called closed to the world, which is basically the fact that borders are only open for citizens or permanent residents who are out of the country and were willing to return. Then from there, we had a group of 125 countries, the majority of the countries who actually are open now, but with restrictions, meaning that citizens from other countries, if they are fully vaccinated, or if they can provide a negative test of COVID, or if they are willing to quarantine, they can actually entry to a particular country. And just a small number of countries, which is 14 of them, who there is no restrictions, you are actually able to come. And this has been changing, and we have been looking at this map from kayak.com on an ongoing basis for quite a few months. And it has been a lot of changes happening. The world is moving from pretty much everything red to a lot of countries in yellow, and slightly a few of them are actually moving into the green. Definitely is around Europe where we have seen that those countries are easing their restrictions quite quickly. There is an economic driver into all that, and of course the role of vaccine and other things. Around our neighborhood, close to Asia, there are a lot more restrictions still happening. And I think it's important for that reason just to understand what's the rationality that exists behind this, like why some countries are actually moving quickly than others. And of course, we all know that apart from politics, because there is a lot of conversations about is politics, but the reality is that of course there are a lot of like economic drivers into all this. A lot of the countries who are easing the restrictions, they are also dealing not only with a health emergency, but also with an economic emergency. There are countries who have been deeply impacted by COVID-19 from an economic point of view, and they depend a lot in sectors who are key for them, like tourism, just to provide jobs. And as you can see in this chart, a lot of these European countries that are easing restrictions, of course, they need the economic stimulus coming from international visitors to provide jobs and to really help them with the economic situation that they have. And that in Australia and New Zealand is not the case. I don't think we have been really dealing with an economic crisis itself. Of course, it has been economic difficulties, but it's a very difficult position. And for that reason, the ease of border restriction from an economic point of view, it doesn't seem that it's as urgent as in other countries. Now, I have to say that it's not only about politics, it's not only about economics, it's also about the perception and how society is feeling in regards to border restrictions. And the OECD has been doing a lot of great analysis to understand the social impact, that especially in mental health, that COVID-19 has created across the world. And it's quite interesting to see this chart. And to be honest, I was like, okay, this makes sense. A lot of the things that's happening here in Australia and New Zealand. What you're going to see in the screen now is basically the level of anxiety that unfortunately exists across different countries and how's that changed after COVID-19. So you can see 13% of the population in Australia suffer of some sort of level of anxiety. Also France, Italy, New Zealand, Spain, Mexico, and the US. The analysis actually covers many other countries. But as you can see in Australia, so it was before COVID-19, it was about 13%. And in New Zealand, it was about 60%. Let me just put it in here. So 13 and 16%. What is quite interesting is also just to see how much these have changed during COVID-19. Look at Australia, from 30% nearly doubled to 21%. And as a result of COVID, nearly 1 out of 5 people in Australia are suffering with some certain level of anxiety. New Zealand as well are nearly triple the number of people dealing with anxiety. And obviously, COVID is creating a really change in perception and issues that we need to also to understand. What amazes me is, for example, the levels in Australia in comparison to places like France, Italy, or even Spain. Those countries in here, they had unfortunately, they had way too many active cases of COVID, way many hospitalizations, and sadly, way too many fatalities in comparison to what we experienced in Australia and New Zealand. But even then, here we actually are dealing with the same level of anxiety. And I think this is important so we can actually understand the public perception that exists towards easing travel border restrictions. Sometimes I know that it feels that it's kind of personal. It feels when you see an article saying, you know, people are against this. It feels that is because they don't like international students, but that's not necessarily the case. Is that we are actually dealing with high level of anxieties in our countries. So anything that actually seems to be incrementing the risk, of course, there is a reaction from the public in regards to that. Now, the good thing is that all of this is changing too. And all this data that I present that is more about 2020, through 2021, it has been a big change. In terms of the economics, it's great to see that in Australia and in New Zealand, there is more and more reports and studies from really the authorities that manage the economy, like the Central Bank of Australia, the Central Bank of New Zealand, and the Treasury of both countries, acknowledging that border restrictions cannot go like that for way too long. They acknowledge the fact that this is affecting productivity, skill shortages, and things that actually they are not necessarily visual, or you don't feel it in the short run, but actually they have a compound negative effect in the following years. And for that reason, it's great to see that there is interest to fix that. It's not as we sometimes think that, oh, they're not going to deal with it. But of course, they need to balance that with things like public perception and, of course, still the health risk that it could actually come with dealing with international borders opening. But also public perception, it has changed. There is a very good survey from University of Sydney in terms of the public perception, and about now 55% of the Australian population, they are, you know, happy to see the ease of border restrictions within a controlled environment. And all this, of course, is attached to the vaccination rates. All this is attached, and this is the experience that we also have seen in European countries and in North America, that as we progress in getting more adults or a larger part of the population vaccinated, these levels of anxieties will drop. This acceptance that things will open will actually increase. And this is why we need to look into how we can actually move forward in terms of vaccination rates. Now, just to let you know, before I really get into the vaccine part of the presentation, I was looking at the stats, and countries like France and Germany and the United States, well, France and Germany, they're quite interesting. Only 35 or 38% of the population is completely vaccinated. So that shows that it's not only about now the health, it's the public perception and the economic, what is playing around. And that balance, a way in which we actually see at the different factors is what is going to tell us when and how border restrictions will ease here in Australia and New Zealand. But definitely, it's all about the vaccination rate. That's the game changer, and we know that. And I think it's important just to have a close look of how we're actually moving, but also how that's going to have an impact in our sector. So let me just start with the simple kind of data in terms of vaccines. And I'm going to say this or show this because it's not that easy sometimes to understand where or how many doses we need in Australia or in New Zealand to reach the targets that we're aiming for. So this is information that comes from the Department of Health here in Australia, where basically we estimate that there are 20 million adults in Australia. And as simple as this, everybody needs 2 doses of a vaccine. So we really need about 40 million doses of vaccine to reach 100% of the adult population being fully vaccinated. Now, we know that not every single adult in Australia will take the vaccine for many reasons. So a lot of people are actually aiming for the 75, 80% of the adult population, which is about 30 million. I'm just giving you all these figures so we can actually understand where are we heading, what are the targets, and what will be the impact in our sector. Now, at the moment, this is how we are. And this is the daily vaccine average here in Australia. As you can say, from 50,000 in April, vaccines a day in average. Now in July, we're about 126,000. Now, I don't want to get into discussion of how slow or quick it is. This is probably something that it goes beyond the analysis. My grandma used to say that when you are hungry, no matter how quickly the kitchen is cooking, you will think that it's going very slowly. And the reality is that we are not hungry, we're starving at the moment. So we wish we will go faster, but this is where we are at the moment. So basically using these daily rates or about 125,000 and also using some of the projections provided by the Australian government, that is actually quite recent that they put some of these projections, we can estimate that about 50% of the adult population could be vaccinated by nearly probably the end of September or mid-October. And then 75% of the population would actually be vaccinated by the end of December. Now, of course, these are estimates. Of course, everything can change. But what we are trying to do here is just to draft and trying just to have an idea of what could happen, so we actually are ready in case that happens. Because a few countries are actually struggling with this. Like, I think that we have seen a few reports from Canada and the US where the ease of restrictions was so quick that basically we're not ready. And now they're having a lot of problems in terms of getting visas for students to come in. And the students are actually very, very upset about the fact that you are finally able to get in, but you cannot get a visa. So once again, these are just estimates. This is just to have an idea of what could happen, so we are actually ready for it. And let me just take you through what we also know based on the international experience that happens when vaccination rates increases, how actually that has been affecting and basically the move of the mobility of individuals and how it could actually affect our sector. So just bear with me for a second. So what we know based on what other countries are doing is this. The first group that is really allowed to move outside of the borders is citizens and residents who are fully vaccinated. So basically, this is what we have seen in Europe and in North America and in some other parts of the world. So the moment that your vaccination rate reach certain level, is first the citizens and the permanent residents of a particular country, the ones who are allowed to go out. Because of course, you can have the reassurance that they got the right vaccine. You can actually have an app that shows you that they got the vaccine, so you can actually let them come in with no restrictions. So that's really the first group that is allowed to move around borders. The next group that we have seen, and this is exactly the news that we received in the last few weeks, is the fully vaccinated international visitor, but from selected countries who are allowed to move across borders. In the case of Europe and North America, it's interesting because it's only fully vaccinated individuals who has things like a Pfizer vaccine, an AstraZeneca vaccine, a Moderna, or a Johnson & Johnson who are actually able just to go across the country. And finally, we have seen the semi or non-vaccinated international visitors who, in some cases, as I showed you in the map with Kayak, in some cases you can come in. There's only 14 countries that allow that. But in others, there are some restrictions like having a test or taking quarantine. But those are the main three groups that actually we're going to see. And in the way in which we move forward, those are going to be the main three groups that we're going to have to engage with from the perspective of international education. So if we actually plot these estimates, and once again, it's just estimates, we actually can start thinking that the first group, if you think about it, if it's going to be citizens and actually from our countries, the first ones who are going to be able just to go across borders, we're actually talking about outbound mobility students. So basically Australian or New Zealand students in our universities who the moment who are fully vaccinated, they will be able just to travel the country. This is if we actually follow what the world is doing, which not all the time we do that, but if we follow that, it will be like that. And once again, this is just to map where we're going. And this is important because we need to be aware that this is gonna happen. I think it's gonna be interesting to see what happened probably in September or in October when you're gonna have, and that's gonna happen, you're gonna have a large group of your students who are fully vaccinated, and they're gonna start asking those questions. Can I go abroad? Can I go on exchange? What can I do? and we need to be ready for that. Just to let you know, we're actually currently conducting a survey across all the university sector here in Australia, asking students directly how or what are the preferences about going overseas. And from that very large group, only 17% said, I'm not going. So we have about 83% of students who are actually considering going abroad. So we need to start planning ahead. And I'm not saying that this means that you as an institution will have exchange programs ready and stuff like that, but I'm just trying to figure out what are we gonna do and what are the questions that we're gonna have to respond when the vaccination rate progresses, because interestingly, is probably going to be the first group that is going to, in large numbers, being able just to go across the borders. Now, the next group, if once again we follow the international experience, is going to be this group of vaccinated visitors. We actually have seen some reports from Canada in particular, and I think Germany actually made the announcement 2 days ago that if you're an international student who have a vaccine, you will be able to come back to the country and you don't need to quarantine. Now, what I think is interesting is that those countries, as I said, they are saying if you're an international student who has a Pfizer, an AstraZeneca, a Moderna, or a Johnson & Johnson, you can come in. And of course, those news are actually making us nervous and thinking that we're getting a competitive edge or we're actually going to miss out. But the reality is that I think we need to think about how many individuals on the age between 18 and 35 in Southeast Asia or North Asia actually have access to those type of vaccine at this stage. I don't think that not that many. So we really, when we reach this particular point, we really need to think about how we're actually going to engage and actually have an approach that actually probably could work for the sector. For example, the World Health Organization approves all those 4 vaccines that I mentioned, but also approves the 2 main vaccines that are actually used in China. So it's interesting just to start figuring out how we're actually going to engage and what are going to be the way in which we move forward. But also, and this is actually quite interesting, especially for our friends in New Zealand, it's the role of study abroad students, because different to Southeast and North Asia, you're going to have a large number of students in North America and in Europe who are actually fully vaccinated. And we know that those are the markets for semester abroad programs. So maybe those are going to be actually an opportunity really just to cushion the effects and something that we need to consider that they may happen. In fact, probably you're already getting inquiries from students from those countries saying, hey, I'm fully vaccinated. Can I go and visit you? So we need to start thinking about what's going to be our response for that particular group and how we're actually going to engage with the students that eventually will be fully vaccinated. And of course, we're always going to have to manage the situation of students who are not going to be vaccinated and they need to be quarantined. And I think in that particular area, both Australia and New Zealand, they have really good plans. And it's great to hear that a lot of, this is research made by QS, they have been continuously telling students, they are telling us that they don't mind the quarantine aspect of it. So it's good, and in that aspect, I think we're pretty well covered, but we're gonna not have to know how to execute those plans when we are actually ready. So I think that what is crucial is that during this period, a lot of things can change. As I said, one of the things that we have seen in other countries is that this ease of restrictions actually goes very quickly. Now, maybe it's not going to happen as quickly here in Australia and New Zealand, but it will actually move very quickly. So during this period, when if we reach 50% of the adult population vaccinated or 75% of the population, apart from waiting for the authorities just to move into the policy of easing restrictions, I think this is going to be a very important time just to start getting the supply chain ready once again. As I said, what happened in Canada and in the US is that basically, they couldn't get student visas. So I just would not imagine the disaster that would be that after all these, the student waiting for more than a year, you tell them that there are not student visas. So we need to start getting ready for all those things. The same goes with English testings like IELTS and TOEFL. All these things, we need to start when we reach this point whenever we reach, we need to start to get them ready and to start putting the resources and the planning in place so we can actually go ahead faster than what happened in other countries. I also think that it's going to be crucial that during this period of, maybe October and November, that we get good market research. This is when it will be great just to follow up the absolutely outstanding job done by organizations like QS, IDP Connect, and Austrade, and many others who through the pandemic have been giving us all this great market research, just to understand that to the clear possibility, now final possibility of having an opportunity to come in country, how international applicants are going to react to that. Because the big question that we have is, in 2022, even if we have the borders open, are they still going to come to us? Well, it's still very uncertain at this stage. But when we reach probably the 50 or the 70 and we have like a better idea, this is when we need that market research. And also your institution can actually conduct that market research. So I think that those are the things that we can actually do so we actually can get ready when all this happens. So as you see, we're still facing a lot of uncertainties. And I really hope that these quick data snapshots really help just to have a better understanding of where we're heading and trying just to map our response to something that has been very challenging for way, way, way too long. I think that looking into the data is something that we can still do, and as we did, just to look into the impact in postgrad versus the impact to undergrad. And I think that in each sector and each institution, I invite you just to do that exercise, because it's really telling us where could actually put our limited resources just to engage more effectively under the new circumstances. Because I truly believe that institutional efforts matter. I think that what we have seen in terms of the response from the sector, it has been extraordinary under such a difficult circumstances. I think that we are doing the best that we can, and I think that the numbers actually showing that. So keep doing those institutional efforts matters, but we need to start getting ready, especially I think that September, October, we're gonna start getting more clarity of where we headed. But basically, it's like they say, winter is coming. Well, seems like summer is coming. We still don't know, but things can actually move quite rapidly. So we better be ready because it's gonna happen. And as I said at the start of the presentation, due to the uncertainties, due to the exhaustion that we have because of COVID, sometimes it's hard just to think about it. But I think that we need to make that effort just to really start drafting the way in which we're gonna move forward. So this is basically what we had for today. I really hope that you find the information useful. It was something that we want to share with you once again, and hopefully they will complement your own institutional or individual. That's it. All right. Excellent. Okay, well, I'm gonna let you go. Thank you so much for joining the session once again. It's just brief, it's just quick, but we just wanna provide with some additional information that could be useful for each one of you. So hopefully we'll be in touch with you again. And once again, thank you for your time, and we'll see you very soon.